Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I knew the line was coming before my father even lifted his glass, because it always came dressed in the same polite rhythm and the same careful smile and the same expectation that I would take it like a vitamin. Swallow and nod and thank them for the privilege of being compared. So when he cleared his throat and said we should all raise a glass to the real achiever in the family, my sister Rebecca, I did what I have trained myself to do since I was a teenager, which is lock the muscles in my face into something warm and useful, stand up without scraping the chair, and say I'll bring dessert, because nothing keeps the peace like someone who knows when to leave the room at the exact right moment. While I was in the kitchen pretending to fuss over pie and coffee, the part of me that used to sag under that sentence just sat this one out, because I have spent months turning one ugly fact into a lever big enough to move an entire dinner table. And once you hold a lever like that, you stop needing the kind of approval that arrives in toasts you never asked for. So I stacked plates, breathed steadily, and let the old resentment float past like background noise you stop hearing once you learn where the volume knob is. And I reminded myself that tonight wasn't about rehashing every time my parents funded one of Rebecca's big ideas while telling me I was being too ambitious, or every time they described my work as a nice hobby while flying across the country to take photos inside her rented office, because tonight had a schedule and a trigger, and I was already right on time. I should tell you how the favoritism looks from the inside, because people like to pretend it is subtle when it is not, and it never has been in our house, where the smallest milestone on Rebecca's path is treated like a holiday. And my bigger moments are treated like a phase I might grow out of, and when I try to explain this to friends, they say all families have blind spots and maybe mine just communicates love in complicated ways, which sounds generous until you are the person at the sink doing the dishes after another round of applause for someone else's story, and you catch yourself listing your own accomplishments in your head like a child reciting spelling words, wondering which one you mispronounced to make it not count. I have a rule now that I never argue the scoreboard, because arguing makes you sound needy and nobody gives points for sounding needy, so instead I learned to keep receipts. And the first receipt in this little collection is an email from an investor who tried to reach Rebecca and somehow copied me by mistake, and in that email, he spelled out a mess so specific that I read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining the shape of it, because he mentioned promises on paper that do not exist, revenue numbers that cannot be verified, and an award that was supposedly confirmed even though the organization he named had already published their finalists and Rebecca's company was nowhere on it. And once I realized the gap between the story my parents rehearse and the story that actually exists, I stopped wanting a bigger slice of their praise and started wanting the truth to walk in on its own legs and sit down next to the centerpiece. So I plated the pie and poured coffee, and I set one plate aside just long enough to make a call I have been drafting since October, the kind of call where you do not need to convince anyone of anything because the facts already carry their own weight. And I reached Evan, who is not a journalist in the glamorous sense, but is exactly the right kind of person to knock gently and ask for clarity at the worst possible moment, a former colleague of Rebecca's who left her project earlier this year after discovering that clarity was never welcomed, and I told him that if he wanted to ask a few questions in person, tonight would be both convenient and instructive, and that he would not need to force anything because my family is very good at performing confidence in front of an audience. And he said he was in the neighborhood, and he thanked me with a steady calm that made me feel like I had just set a timer on a stove I no longer needed to watch. You might think I'm cruel for inviting someone who could embarrass my sister in front of our parents, and I will accept your judgment if you offer it honestly, but I have tried every polite version of fairness you can try. From conversations where I bent over backward to see her side, to keeping my head down while she toured our family's support like a showroom, to swallowing the irritation when my mother used the phrase "your sister just has that spark," as if the rest of us are batteries that cannot hold a charge, and none of that changed the fact that Rebecca has been building a pyramid out of promises other people are expected to keep. So if calling Evan is a sin, then it is the kind I can live with. The kind that says we all get to answer for the stories we sell to the people who love us. When I carried the dessert back in, Rebecca was mid-anecdote about a partnership she said was closing in the new year. My father was nodding with the tender pride of a coach who believes he discovered the athlete. My mother was doing that thing where she glances at me to check if I am clapping correctly, and I smiled and set the plates down and asked Rebecca the sort of question that sounds supportive until you hear the precision in it. Something about the contract terms she had mentioned in a podcast that mysteriously disappeared last week, and she took the bait with her usual certainty, laying out details that I know cannot be true, while I refilled cups and said nothing else, because tonight is about gravity, not volume. And gravity never has to shout. I did not slam any doors or raise my voice or make a speech about respect, because that would give everyone a reason to blame my tone instead of the facts, and I would rather be the quiet person who sets up the board and waits than the loud one who flips it. And as Rebecca kept talking and my parents kept nodding, I felt the timer that only I could hear start to hum, a small current under the table, and I knew that sometime soon there would be a knock and a conversation and a silence that would finally belong to me, and I also knew that, later that night, I would see a message from Rebecca asking why our mother could not stop pacing, but that is getting ahead of me, and for now all you need to know is that the dessert looked perfect, the coffee was strong, and the clock, for once, was working for me. If you have ever sat through a lifetime of small slights delivered with soft voices and good intentions, you learn to stop arguing about feelings and start tracking facts, which is not romantic and not festive and not the way a daughter is expected to behave on a holiday, but it keeps you from doubting your own memory when the story gets rewritten over coffee. So months before tonight, I started a folder that lived on a plain drive with a boring name, and inside it I kept copies of the things people said in public next to the records of what actually happened, because nothing cuts through a toast like a contradiction you can point to without raising your voice. Rebecca's greatness, as my parents describe it, did not appear out of nowhere, and I am not saying she is talentless or lazy. I am saying that every time she threw a dart, someone else held the board in place and called the bullseye, which looked like parental love if you did not know that the tuition help they insisted they could not afford for me appeared a few years later as seed money for her first launch, or that the car they pronounced unnecessary when I needed to commute for work somehow became essential when she posted about meetings that were mostly coffees with people she tagged as mentors, and when I dared to point this out I became the ungrateful one who could not celebrate someone else's shine. And if you have ever been told that tone matters more than truth, you know exactly how quickly that conversation ends. I am good at my job because it does not care about tone, it cares about whether a claim can be backed up by something traceable. So when the misdirected email from the investor landed in my inbox and I saw references to a round that had not closed and revenue that did not match the state filings and an award he believed she had secured even though the public list contained other names entirely, I did not get excited or angry. I just started collecting, and I asked a few quiet questions too. People who had worked with her and heard the kind of weary answers that people give when they are trying to stay gracious after discovering that the calendar invite they cleared an afternoon for was really just a photo opportunity for the person who needed to look busy. Evan was one of those people, a decent guy who left when the invoices stopped making sense and the language around delays started sounding like the weather, unavoidable and no one's fault, and when I first reached out to him months ago I did not pitch revenge. I pitched clarity, because I wanted my footing back, and he gave me dates and emails and 3 polite sentences that confirmed more than I expected, and when I told him I was fine waiting for the right moment he said something that stuck with me, that people who tell the truth do not need to control the timing. The truth can walk into any room, and that is when I decided that my family's living room might finally see it stroll across the carpet. The part that still makes me shake my head is how my parents made it easier, because they have this habit of narrating Rebecca's milestones with details they do not verify, and parents do that sometimes because it feels good to believe. But it also makes them useful to someone who wants to inflate a story and outsource the marketing, so for the last few months, every time they recited a new line about her nomination or her partnership or her expansion, I asked a plain question and wrote down the answer they offered, which created a neat little spreadsheet of statements that could be tested without drama, and if you think that sounds cold, you are not wrong, but I needed something colder than nostalgia to make sure I did not waver when the moment came. Tonight's moment was not the toast, that was just the way-up call I did not need. The moment was the conversation I steered 15 minutes later when I asked Rebecca, in that bright, supportive voice that makes people relax. To tell my parents again about the recognition she said was already confirmed for the spring, because I had a friend who was obsessed with that organization and would lose her mind when she heard, and Rebecca, who loves an audience, leaned in and described the selection process, the rubric, the prestige, and the benefits that were supposedly guaranteed, and I nodded like a fan even as I recognized phrases lifted straight from last year's brochure. The one that clearly says finalists are announced publicly and any pretense of early confirmation would disqualify you on the spot, and my mother reached for my hand the way she does when she wants me to be included, as if the touch itself replaces consideration, and I smiled and squeezed back because tonight, inclusion would not be something I begged for, it would be something gravity delivered. The favor I cashed in was small and human, not dramatic or cinematic, which is why it worked. Earlier in the week, I had asked my neighbor, who runs a tidy newsletter that local investors actually read, to confirm whether press inquiries to the award body received the same answer I found on their site, and he had replied with a forwardable note that said, in polite language, that no finalists had been selected and that any claims to the contrary were either misunderstandings or misrepresentations, and I thanked him and tucked the email into the folder because a sentence like that does more work than an argument ever could, and tonight, while pouring refills, I quietly sent that note to our family group thread with a message that looked innocent and seasonal, something about collecting links for a little year-in-review album to show Grandma tomorrow. Would everyone drop in any news items they were proud of so I could print a few pages, and I added 2 links that were already open on my phone, one to the finalist list from last year to show the format, and one to the current page where the words not yet announced sit plainly for anyone who can read. I knew exactly what would happen, because our family, like most families, checks the group thread during dessert even while pretending not to, and my mother would click and frown and say she must be reading it wrong. And my father would put on his glasses and say the site must not be updated, and Rebecca would keep smiling, but her fingers would tighten around the stem because she understands that once a claim is on a screen in front of the people who love you, it stops floating and starts sinking. And here is the revenge you asked me to deliver by the end of each chapter, small and clean and easy to deny, but impossible to undo, because I did not accuse or expose or push. I just handed the room a simple question with receipts attached and let them decide how curious they wanted to be. As I pressed send on that perfectly ordinary family message and slipped my phone back into my pocket, I felt the shape of the night change the way a conversation changes when someone finally says the quiet thing without raising their voice. And I could already hear the next beat I had planned, because Evan had answered my call and was finishing up nearby, and he had agreed to drop by with a very normal pretext, a small gift from the office and a quick hello to my parents, nothing threatening, nothing theatrical. Just a face from the version of Rebecca's world that my parents never see, and while my mother started to puzzle over the link and Rebecca began to talk faster the way she does when she needs to flood the room, the doorbell that no one expected yet was on its way, and the bait I had set months ago was finally about to pull something heavy to the surface. The thing about people who are used to being applauded is that they think applause is a renewable resource, so when the first thin crack appears and someone in the room starts actually reading, their survival instinct pushes them to talk faster, to add more details, to insist that everyone is just missing the context, which is exactly what Rebecca did as my mother frowned at her phone and my father muttered about websites never being on time, because she shifted into the tone she uses on panels and podcasts, that confident glide that makes strangers lean in, and she began laying out the story of the nomination with such precision that a person might think she had just stepped out of the committee meeting itself, which is how I knew the trap would spring without any help from me, since the only thing worse than a shaky claim is a shaky claim with timestamps attached to every sentence. I did not push or prod or raise an eyebrow, because I've learned that the cleanest way to catch a lie is to make it comfortable, so I kept my voice in that gentle, supportive register that has always been my camouflage, and I asked for the fun parts. The personal stuff that sells well at family tables, like when she first got the call, who she told, what she had to sign, and whether they had given her any guidance about announcing it, and she did what she always does when the spotlight is on. Her, which is paint a vivid timeline with specific dates and phrases that sound important, mentioning a confidentiality clause here and a preliminary media hold there. And my parents relaxed visibly because the story suddenly had the kind of shape they like, the kind that can be retold later at church or at brunch with the neighbors. And as Rebecca talked, I watched her choose words that I knew would be easy to check and impossible to defend once the actual organization confirmed that no such process existed. I have kept quiet for years at this table out of a sense of loyalty that never seemed to flow back in my direction. So tonight I decided that loyalty would look like clarity, and clarity would look like getting her to confirm her claims in a place that could not be edited later, which is why I pulled out my phone casually and said that Grandma would love to hear this story in her voice. Could I record 30 seconds so we could send it to her tonight? And Rebecca, who has never met a camera she did not trust, nodded with that gracious smile that says she is doing you a favor when in fact you are doing one for her, and she repeated the key beats with even tighter language, adding that the award would unlock partnerships already underway and that early confirmation had been given verbally by a friend on the advisory board, which was a new flourish I had not heard before and which, to my quiet satisfaction, would turn out to be the thread that unravels the whole sweater. My father asked her to send him the logo so he could add it to the family update he was drafting for the holidays, which would have thrilled me as a child and depressed me as an adult, but in this moment I understood it as another piece of leverage, because once he posted that message to the usual place where his old colleagues coo over our family news, there would be a record of exactly what Rebecca had claimed, and when that message met the reality of the organization's timeline, the correction would no longer be a private annoyance between sisters, it would be a course change for the people who had built their pride around her narrative and dismissed mine as noise. Here is where I will admit a small, unflattering satisfaction, which is that while Rebecca performed certainty for the room, I quietly sent a text to Evan with 2 short lines, one asking him to bring the small gift bag through the front door instead of the side, and the other suggesting he open with congratulations on the big nomination, so we could watch the shape of her face when the echo of her own words came back at her from someone who knew the actual process, because I wanted a moment. That was not loud but was undeniable, the kind that does not rely on my opinion or on old family grievances, but on the simple friction that occurs when a story hits a wall. If you are wondering whether I felt guilty about arranging a situation where my sister might be embarrassed in front of our parents, I will tell you that I have felt the bitterness of being sidelined so many times that what I felt tonight was something closer to steadiness than to glee, because I was not planning to humiliate her. I was planning to stop enabling a pattern that has siphoned love and resources in one direction for so long that it started to feel like gravity, and I believed that if the 4 of us could watch a small truth land in the middle of the table and stay there without anyone sweeping it to the floor, then whatever happened next would at least proceed from reality instead of from a script we keep pretending is spontaneous. To make sure the evening did not veer into shouting, I delivered my own small act of revenge right there, the kind that hides behind kindness and cannot be criticized without sounding ridiculous. Because I asked my mother if she would like me to read aloud the email from the award office that my neighbor had forwarded, since the language was so formal it might help reassure everyone. And when she handed me her phone, I read the sentence that said finalists would be notified in the spring and that no early selections had been made, and then I read it again slowly and thanked them for their time, and I smiled at Rebecca and said that maybe her friend on the advisory board had been misinformed, which allowed her an exit if she wanted one while also locking the room to the shape of the truth, and the relief I saw cross my father's face as he processed the clarity told me that even he was tired of carrying a balloon he had to protect from every sharp corner. He still asked for the logo, out of habit as much as hope, and Rebecca promised to send it later, and I could feel the air of the room change in that subtle way you only notice when you have watched it for years. Because my parents stayed supportive, but they stopped performing the triumph, and Rebecca kept talking, but she started asking as many questions as she answered. And beneath all of it there was the quiet sound of a story sliding into a lane that did not belong to her anymore, and that is when the doorbell rang in that ordinary way that never means anything in our family, except for tonight, when it meant everything, because the person on the other side carried nothing more dangerous than a polite hello and a paper bag with 2 mugs. Yet I knew he also carried the one thing Rebecca could not outtalk, which was a memory that matched the receipts. Evan stepped into the room with that careful politeness people use when they know they are entering a family moment and do not want to step on anything fragile. And he held up a small paper bag with 2 plain mugs from his office and said he was on his way to drop these at a friend's place and thought, since he was close, he would say hello and wish everyone a good holiday. Which was the kind of harmless pretext no one can resent, and my father, who likes a guest because a guest is an audience, waved him in with that big friendly energy that has narrated our family's highlights for years, and he introduced Evan to my mother and then to Rebecca with a proud line about her latest recognition, which gave Evan the exact opening we had agreed he would take. A sincere congratulations followed by a simple request for details that sounded like admiration rather than scrutiny, because the fine edge of this plan was never about confrontation, it was about letting the room hear facts arrive in a tone no one could reasonably call hostile. Evan is good at sounding curious in a way that makes people feel seen, so he asked how the nomination worked and whether there were rounds and whether Rebecca already had next steps, and Rebecca, who is used to this dance, smiled with her stage smile and repeated the talking points she had just given my parents, leaning on the same clean phrases and the same timeline, only this time the words did not just float across the table and disappear. They met a person who had been inside the actual process and who knew how the organization guarded its calendar, so when he gently said that was interesting because, in his experience, early confirmations would raise compliance flags and usually got people disqualified, you could feel a small hitch in the conversation, the kind that would pass unnoticed on another night, but that tonight sounded like a seam finally showing. I did not jump in or add color or perform a gotcha, because the point was never to watch her squirm. The point was to stop the machine that kept rewarding a version of her story that did not exist. So I let my mother offer cookies, and I watched my father try to smooth the moment by cracking a line about every award having its quirks. And I watched Rebecca lean toward Evan with a confidence that was already slipping around the edges as she told him she had a verbal confirmation from a friend on the advisory board, which is where Evan did the exact thing we planned and nodded slowly and said he knew several people there and that advisory members were very careful about boundaries. Then he asked the softest question of the night. Whether the friend worked in governance or in programming, because governance never made calls like that, and programming would not be in the loop until public lists were finalized, and Rebecca's smile faltered in a way my parents could not ignore, and for the first time all evening, the room was quiet enough to hear what the silence meant. Evan did not press. He pivoted like a gentleman to the other topic my parents always enjoy, which is the business itself. And he said he had admired Rebecca's push over the last year and asked how the recent invoices had worked out with a contractor he recognized, because he had seen that name on a shared project a while back, and that was the second seam. Because I already knew those invoices were part of the logjam that led him to resign, and Rebecca, trapped between the need to protect her image and the fear of saying too little in front of my parents, gave a vague answer that sounded polished until Evan, still warm and steady, said he was glad to hear it. Because the contractor had told him a different story and had been considering small claims court until someone covered the balance, which made my mother straighten and my father set down his glass and look at Rebecca with that first thin slice of confusion that always precedes disappointment. This is where I delivered the evening's cleanest act of revenge, not by revealing anything new or waving around documents, but by protecting my parents from the embarrassment of having to walk back a public claim they were about to post proudly. Because while everyone was adjusting to the new shape of the conversation, I took my father's draft family update off the dining room sideboard under the pretense of proofreading, and I quietly removed the paragraph where he had written that Rebecca had secured the award, and in its place I typed 2 simple lines about how we were all excited for the possibilities next year and grateful for the work everyone had put in this season. Which seems small if you are chasing fireworks, but is massive if you have ever watched your parents become unpaid spokespeople for a story that cannot survive daylight. And when I handed the page back and he thanked me for catching a typo, I felt a piece of the old ache loosen because I had not just protected myself from another year of comparison. I had protected them from being used as amplifiers for something that would have made them look foolish. Rebecca tried to rally, because she always rallies, and she said that awards are complicated and that people often get early signals, and that she did not want to bore anyone with bureaucratic details. And Evan, who has the patience of a person who has dealt with too many glossy explanations, nodded again and changed the subject to holiday plans, which gave her an exit without dignity loss if she wanted it, only she kept circling back to the nomination, asking whether he knew if the committee ever made exceptions for special cases, and whether off-cycle announcements were possible, and whether advisory friends could expedite paperwork, and with each question she handed the room another reason to doubt. And my mother started doing that thing she does when she is anxious, straightening silverware that does not need straightening, and my father asked for more coffee that he would not drink, and I sat very still and let the weight of the evening settle exactly where it belonged, on the story rather than on me. Evan glanced at me once, quick and unreadable to anyone who did not know the backstory, and then he stood and thanked my parents for the hospitality and wished Rebecca luck with everything in the spring, a phrasing so precise it could have been a verdict. And at the door he handed me the paper bag with the 2 mugs and a folded note underneath that simply said the investor would wait to hear from Rebecca directly before making any decision, which meant the clock I had started earlier now had a second hand, and after he left I helped my mother stack plates and I hugged my father, and I told Rebecca her pie compliments were deserved even if the rest of the evening had been noisy, and I did not explain what I meant, because explanations are for people still asking for permission. I left before anyone asked me to stay, not in a huff or with a scene, but with the clean exit of a person who finally understands that you do not need a witness to know you have done the right thing. And I drove home thinking about how small and ordinary the moves had been and how heavy their effect felt, and I put my phone face down on the counter because I did not need to see the ripple to know it was already spreading, and hours later, when the house was quiet and the mugs were on the shelf, and the note was filed away with the other receipts, the screen lit with Rebecca's name and a line that made me exhale in a way I had been holding since October, a message that said our mother could not stop pacing and wanted to know what had happened. And I stared at it for a long time because the temptation to answer with a sermon was loud, but the plan was never about catharsis, it was about clarity, and the final move still needed to be played. Rebecca's message sat there with that clipped urgency she uses when she is not sure whether to be scared or defensive, asking what had happened and why our mother was pacing. And for a long minute I let it glow without answering because I wanted the heat of the evening to cool just enough that I would not write something that felt like a victory lap, since the whole point of this plan was to stop the cycle, not feed it. And when I finally typed back I chose the same tone I used at the table. Steady and plain and impossible to misquote, telling her that nothing explosive happened, that we all heard her make claims that do not line up with public facts, that a person who knows the process confirmed as much, and that our parents, who have spent years carrying her story like a family banner, deserved not to be put in that position again. And then I added the part that mattered, which was that she had a choice about what happened next, and that I was going to give her a fair one. I told her I had put together a small packet that included the misdirected investor email, the confirmation from the award office about timelines, a short note from the contractor about outstanding invoices that had been covered by a third party, the 30 seconds of her repeating the timeline for Grandma, and a very simple 2-paragraph statement that anyone in her situation could post without humiliation, one that framed the whole thing as a misunderstanding corrected by new information, with a promise to share verified milestones in the spring when the organization made its decisions, and I told her that if she posted that correction to the same places she has used to hype herself, and if she called our parents in the morning to apologize for making them claim something they could not defend, I would consider the matter closed, and I would not send the packet to anyone else. She wrote back fast with a wall of indignation about how I had ambushed her, and how Evan's presence was manipulative, and how families should support each other in public. And I let her finish, and then answered slowly that I had spent many years supporting her in public while being erased in private, that I had watched our parents become accidental spokespeople for a story that kept changing to fit whatever praise she wanted next, and that I had reached the point where support without truth is just complicity, and I reminded her that I had not confronted her in front of anyone, that I had actually protected our parents from posting an announcement that would have humiliated them, and that my ask was not punishment. It was the bare minimum of accountability she would expect from a colleague if the roles were reversed. She went quiet for a while, and in that quiet I did the second thing I needed to do for myself, which was to reset the field with our parents, because if I left the dynamics untouched, the next holiday would just be a rerun with new lines. So I wrote them a short email that said I loved them and that I was tired, that holiday dinners had become campaigns where one child was the candidate and the other was the audience, that I would not be competing for approval anymore, and that I would not sit through any more toasts that ranked their children like a scoreboard, and then I gave them a simple structure for going forward, that we keep our family group thread for actual updates supported by links that can be checked, that we stop making public announcements about each other's business without verifying first, and that if they cannot do that, I will bow out of the public parts and see them for quiet lunches where we talk about real life instead of headlines. And I ended with a line that was harder to write than it sounds, that their pride is not a currency I need in order to value myself. Then I played the last move, the one that made the evening more than a clever dinner trick, by writing a clean message to the investor who had copied me by mistake months ago, copying Rebecca with a calm courtesy that gave her full view, wishing him a good holiday and letting him know I believed he meant well, and explaining that some claims he had heard were not yet confirmed by the award organization according to their own public statements, that contractors had flagged billing concerns that might affect timelines, and that to protect everyone involved from confusion I would be stepping away from any accidental communications, and that he should coordinate directly with Rebecca on any next steps. I did not accuse her of fraud, and I did not ask him to cut ties. I simply cleared my name from the CC line and put the responsibility back where it belonged, which meant that whatever she said next would live or die on contact with someone who was actually writing checks. Rebecca finally responded just before midnight with a shorter note, less bluster, asking whether I would really send the packet if she did nothing, and I told her the truth, that I had no interest in burning her life down, that I did not want to hurt her, that I wanted her to stop using our parents as her press office and to stop telling stories that put other people on the hook, and that the packet would go to exactly 2 places, if she chose pride over repair, to the award office so they could make their own determination about misuse of their name, and to the investor to ensure he was not relying on claims that could put him in a bind, and I told her she had until the end of the week to post the correction and make the call. Not because I was a warden handing out deadlines, but because adults draw boundaries and then keep them. I went to bed with the same calm I had felt when I cut the paragraph from my father's draft, that sense that I had finally acted like the version of myself I keep promising to become. And in the morning there was an email from my mother saying she had slept badly and she was sorry if the toast had hurt me, and that she did not realize how heavy it had become over the years. And there was a second email from my father that was shorter and more honest than any he has sent me on a holiday, saying he had reread the links and that he was embarrassed, that he would not be posting an update this year, and that he was proud of me for handling a hard thing without making a scene, which was the first time in a long time that his pride felt like a gift instead of a trade. By midday, Rebecca posted a careful message that sounded close enough to the 2 paragraphs I had written that I recognized the skeleton, saying there had been a misunderstanding about timing and that she was excited to continue the process like everyone else. And she sent a screenshot of a call log with our parents, which I did not comment on because I did not need to, and later she texted me the shortest sentence I have ever gotten from her, asking whether we were good, and I told her that we were as good as her choices would allow us to be, that I was not her enemy and never had been, but that the era of me cushioning her landing was over, and that we could be sisters without me being her stagehand. And I thanked her for doing the right thing because grace does not weaken a boundary, it just makes it easier to live with. There are still questions I cannot answer for you, like whether the investor will stay, whether the award will turn into anything in the spring, or whether my parents will actually keep the new rules once the glow of the apology fades. But those are not my jobs anymore, and that is the real win, that I stopped applying for a role I did not want and stopped holding my breath for a toast I never needed. And when I think back to the moment my father lifted his glass and called my sister the real achiever in the family, I do not feel the old sting. I feel the clean click of the timer I set with my own hands, because the ending was not a dramatic unmasking or a public spectacle. It was a quiet redistribution of truth and weight. And if you are waiting to hear whether I think I went too far, I can tell you that what I did was not polite and it was not soft, but it was fair and it was smart, and it was the first time in years that I chose myself without asking anyone's permission, which is why, when my phone lit up that night and my sister asked what had happened, I finally had an answer that changed everything without destroying anything, and that is as close to perfect as revenge gets.